thinking about your state, many of your state economic development agencies have grants. In New York State, when New York State had money, we used to have something called GEMS, G-E-M-S. And that was really to help a smaller entrepreneur sort of get started. Yeah. So it had very specifics, but it was there as a funding source. So check out your state resources as well. Yes. Andrew.
By the way, these are all the classic resources, and these should be where you start. But if you're in a different world and you're talking to angel investors, venture capitalists, private equity sources, as a source of your global growth, make sure they sort of get the global thing. Some of them will finance global growth, some won't. Some of them won't understand the kinds of expenses that you have in your business plan to go global. I mean, when Arnon says, I need an extra week in Brazil, and you have an angel investor, venture capital investor saying, no way, you're not staying, and doesn't understand that that's what it takes to make the extra investment. Again, one of my themes this morning has been disconnects. Look for any disconnects between the perspective and experience of your investors, and instead of making it a negative, make it a positive. Look particularly for investors and sources of capital that do have global experience, that can not only bring money to the table, but bring their Rolodex to the table. I'll tell you a quick funny story. Yesterday I was teaching in my undergraduate course at Maryland, and I made a reference to Rolodex, and a student raised their hand and said, what is a Rolodex? Oh my God, 100 years old.
And the other thing about funding too is not to discount the possibility of working with a partner. So, you know, finding another firm that's in the same business or a complementary business, maybe pooling your resources. So that's kind of an out-of-the-box type of thing. Do we have any time for questions, or is lunch being served?
Oh, who needs lunch? This is education. You always eat later.
Okay, are there any questions? Yes?
Arnon, I have a question for you. When you talked about how your sales have increased from an export perspective, can you talk a little bit about the expense, maybe from a percentage basis? So if 30% of your business is in exports, from a expense perspective, does it correlate, or are the expenses, I mean, both from a travel, tariff, I mean, can you talk just for a second?
It's kind of a great question. You know, one of the challenges when you start to export as a U.S. company is how do you really break off that expense and allocate it to the export market? So, you know, there's my time, there's my SVP of sales time, there's my head of stadium sales time. So there's a percentage of their sales that's clearly allocated to export. The reality is we don't break that out as clearly. Where it gets easier is on something like a Google pay-per-click campaign. You know, we're spending hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars of Google pay-per-click spend. You can track by country and see where these inbound clicks are coming from. So we do allocate that to get a sense of what's going on in terms of export sales. Interestingly enough, I would say that because our general marketing program is funded sort of domestically, so the creation of collateral material, brochures, creation of websites, right? It just becomes that additive expense of translating the website, translating the brochure, which in many times is minimal. So when you kind of think of sort of that additive expense to export, for us, I mean, it's travel, clearly, that's easy to break out.
And I was thinking in terms of, like you were saying, employee cost time, right? Because if you guys are your SVP of sales going, and you're saying it's taking, you know, maybe it takes 50% more of their time to make a sale overseas than it does here. I'm thinking through as a small business owner, how do you figure out where that cost justification?
Absolutely, and you know, candidly, we haven't spent enough time talking about sort of employee time. But one thing we kind of drive home is kind of an internal rule of thumb: you don't get on a plane if the deal isn't $200,000 or more. That's kind of a rule. Find a local agent to refer it to, or send it to an agent in another country like the UK, where we have an agent, and have them sell that. But that's kind of our internal rule of thumb. It probably needs some updated, candidly. But I'd say you kind of honed in precisely on that point, which is the single biggest expense you're going to have to exporting is your time and management's time. And allocating that, like towards any other project you would do a business, has to be thought of very carefully.
You don't fly business class unless it's $300,000.
Right. Well, no, that's exactly right.
I think also working with your accountants, because it would seem to me, just logically thinking, if you're just starting out, you're going to be spending a lot more time. So the percentage of expense is not going to be maximized until your sales get much higher, and then it's going to balance out.
And a corresponding question to that would be, of your export business, how much of it is repeat business? Where once you've built that relationship, because I guess that would sort of tie into that. You have a big investment up front, possibly, but if of your 30% of your export business is, how much of that is repeat sales versus?
Right. So I'd say about 50% of it is repeat sales that we can track to the same distributor or agent.
Okay.
And then what we'll have is over a several-year cycle, we'll have a replacement cycle where people we know will come back and have to reorder or stock up. So. Okay.
I think that's it. We're getting the high sign.
Patience, persistence.
Or was that a question? Okay, done. Sorry about that. I'm sure we'll have time at lunch if you catch up with us. And thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, panelists.